on the Prior Learning Assessment Handbook for the Northeast Resiliency Consortium that you should all have in your inboxes. And we are very, very excited to be talking with you today. I'm Meredith Hatch at Achieving the Dream, and today I'm joined by two Achieving the Dream colleagues, Julia Lawton and Destiny Mitchell. Many of you have met Julia before, and Destiny is an intern working with Achieving the Dream right now. So we're glad to have her on today's webinar. I am going to take just a moment to talk about the webinar technology for today's webinar. We're using GoToWebinar, as you saw on your login screen, and I'm going to talk about how to use particularly the sidebar that you see likely in the right-hand side of your screen. So you should be able to see, first of all, which of your colleagues are on today's webinar on the attendee list. You should also be able to see a place where you can raise your hand. If everyone can raise their hand for me so we can make sure that you're able to access the webinar, that would be excellent. I see a few hands. Thank you. Great. I also want to draw your attention to the question pane. And so a way to participate in this webinar is through the question pane. If you want, you can type in a question into the question pane, and I can read it. So throughout today's webinar, we're going to have several opportunities where our presenter, Nan Travers, is able to respond to the questions that you type in through the question pane. All of the panes can be expanded or minimized by clicking on the plus or the minus button at the top of each pane. So that's a little bit about GoToWebinar. Thank you. So next up, here are our pictures. So Meredith and Julia. I'm Senior Associate Director for Workforce and Academic Alignment, and Julia is an Assistant Director of Programs. We don't yet have a picture of Destiny, but you'll be able to see her by the next webinar that we do. Next, we're going to see if the technology is on our side, and we are going to open Paul Casey from the Northeast Resiliency Consortium, Passaic County Community College, and he is going to introduce our presenter, Nan Travers. So, Paul?
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm happy to introduce Nan Travers. Nan is a leading expert in PLA and is widely published on research and practices in PLA. With over 20 years in PLA programs and policy development, she is widely known nationally and internationally for her work. Recent efforts include leading all 30 SUNY community colleges through analysis of policies and practices and establishment of system-wide PLA policy. Led a Lumina project on the development of college-level learning standards for the assessment of PLA, Global Learning Qualifications Framework. Founding co-editor of PLA Inside Out, an international journal on theory, research, and practices in prior learning assessment, U.S. Board Representative for the Prior Learning International Research Center, co-developed the 5 critical factors model for PLA programs, led extensive research, publications, and workshops on PLA philosophy, research, policies, and practices. Nan has held multiple administrative positions in community colleges and 4-year institutions. And we are really fortunate to have her lead us in this webinar today and build the handbook for us. So thank you, Nan, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm hoping everybody can hear me just fine. So today what we're going to do is look at the some highlights about the handbook. As Meredith mentioned, you will have the handbook in your inbox. I do not expect that you have had a chance to look at this yet, but this will give you an orientation to it, and that way you'll be able to review it before the February meeting of Achieving the Dream and the Resiliency Consortium. We're also going to look at a little bit more on the 5 critical factors inventory and focus mostly on professional development at your college, and then give you some chances for questions and answers. Next. So what we have with the handbook is that we've just developed, and as I've said, you just have gotten this. It consists of 7 chapters and 4 appendices, and I'm going to go through each chapter. So next. Chapter 1 is going to give you an overview of PLA and the different types of prior learning assessment. I know there's some people who are attending today who were at the Northeast Resiliency Consortium meeting in October in Atlantic City, but there are some of you who have not attended. We are recording this so that you can share it with other people at your institutions. And there will be people who will need a good overview of PLA and understanding about that. So this chapter really focuses in on that. It also talks a little bit about non-credit courses, giving the historical roots, research, and resources for current research. So this is a good resource chapter to get that background material. Next. Chapter 2. A little bit further in the webinar, I will be going over the 5 critical factors in more detail. But the 5 critical factors of a PLA program is based on research that we did over 34 institutions, looking at the kinds of things that need to be in place for successful PLA programs. From this, we've been doing more work, and we've organized the handbook around these 5 critical factors. So this kind of gives you a sense of which chapters are dealing with those. Basically, with the 5 critical factors, what we need to really kind of look at for an institution is that the philosophy, mission, and policies are in line, that there is institutional support, that those philosophies, missions, and policies and institutional support really are in alignment with those program practices, the ways in which students are actually able to use the PLA credits towards their degrees, that there really needs to be professional development really beyond the faculty and evaluators. So the handbook does expand that beyond faculty and evaluators, and then looking at program evaluation and improvement. Next. Chapter 3 then is going to look at the PLA philosophy, mission, and policies, and also philosophical approaches to PLA. Unfortunately, today we just don't have time to go into all of this in depth, but within the handbook you will find these pieces. So there are 4 different philosophical approaches that I've identified through my work. And the 4 are called redress, access, lifelong learning, and credentialing. They're explained a bit in the handbook, and I advise that you go look at that, and we'll be talking about this more in February. It's very important to understand the philosophy that different people have towards PLA in order to really see how the practices can be implemented and maintained. And when you have people coming from different philosophical approaches, sometimes it feels like conflict when it's really a just different headset around it. So these are important pieces that I encourage you to spend some time looking at. Okay, next. Chapter 4 is looking at institutional support, and there are 4 areas that I address, which is financial, administrative, faculty, and technology. It's important that there is administrative support and that is really expressed outwardly across the institution. Faculty support, this will not work well if the faculty are not supporting it, so there needs to be a fair amount of work done around faculty support. We address those more in the professional development section. Technology is something that is more and more coming to the surface, and it spans more than just having technological support around this, But from the point of view of, let's say, the registrar's office in terms of how do they use the student information system to log the credits, if you're doing a portfolio process, how do you have systems that can do more of an e-portfolio process? How do you manage the system? So there's many elements of technology that needs to be addressed. The financial side, there are different business models that need to be in place depending on the types of PLA credit that you are accepting. Some things are already part of the institution, but this table here, which is also in the handbook, lays out the different types of PLA that you might be accepting, and then the types of actions that go along with it. So in building the business model, one has to think through both in terms of the fee that you will charge students and the kinds of costs within an institution. There is more detail in the chapter, and I also will be addressing more about the business model in February. Next. In Chapter 5, we're really looking at PLA practices and looking at the different ways in which we start to really look at how students are informed about PLA, the types of PLA that's accepted, the way in which the credits can be accepted and applied to the degree. I can't stress enough that if the process for students being able to accept the credits and apply them to the degree, that has to be extremely explicit to students, and the more ways that they can use the credits, the more advantage this is to them, and they will access the programs. I've looked at a lot of different institutional practices, and those institutions that restrict the ways in which the PLA credits can be used within the curriculum have the least number of students accessing this. So, there's a direct relationship. It makes sense. The more they can use it, the more they'll use it. But it really makes a huge difference if an institution is going to invest in this to really make sure that the policies support the way the students can use them. The assessment of learning is a critical piece that I find is not talked about enough. And again, I won't be able to go into detail about this. We'll be talking more about it in February, and there is more in the handbook. There's a lot more that can be discussed around this. What happens in the whole discussion about assessing learning, one of the fears that faculty have is the integrity of the prior learning assessment process. And so the more that time can be spent and really thought through around how to assess learning and show the ways in which the students are being assessed, faculty will feel more comfortable around the process. But it also opens up conversations about assessing learning beyond prior learning assessment, but across the board, because as you're starting to look at assessing learning for the prior learning assessment, it raises questions about how do we assess learning, period, and how do we start to talk about what is college-level learning. Where we've been moving is looking at competency-based assessments as a way of being able to articulate what students know and to be able to better fit the learning in the curriculum as schools are moving more and more towards having clear learning outcomes and having competency statements. What kind of traditionally in the past, many institutions, not all, but many institutions did a course match on the course description and the objectives, but with the movement much stronger in competencies by having assessment strategies that can measure the competencies learned, there's an easier way to then fit it into the curriculum. That leads me to talking a little bit about the Global Learning Qualifications Framework. We had a Lumina grant to develop a framework for assessing learning that's been acquired outside of the traditional academic environment. And we did an extensive amount of research to go into this because the whole question becomes, what is verifiable college-level learning? And so we felt that we needed to get a good definition of college-level learning. We started off with Lumina's degree qualification profile. We looked at AAC&U's work on liberal arts education with their essential outcomes and their value rubrics. We looked at some other work in the United States. And then we started looking elsewhere and ended up doing basically a meta-analysis of over 90 different countries' qualification frameworks. And so the resulting framework, which also is in the handbook, lays out a competency-based framework for assessing learning. This, besides the fact that I'm totally committed to this, it is really the first attempt in having a definition about what is college-level learning. And so we're hoping that at least it will promote good discussions within an institution. It is an open resource, so it can be adapted, changed, those kinds of things, but it enables to have a good, solid conversation about what is expected in the assessment process. And so one of the slides that I have here that's in the handbook is just looking at the responsibilities from the student side and the institutional side, where we're asking students to reflect on their learning, to self-assess that learning, and to articulate it in such a way that it can be measured. We often talk about wanting students to reflect. In the curriculum, we don't demand of students to do a self-assessment very much and to really articulate what their learning is. It's usually in response to particular questions. And so students really need support around these pieces. At the same time, institutional assessment responsibilities is to be able to recognize different learning, to assess that learning, and to credential it. And again, these are new skills in many ways for institutions. So both in terms of the PLA practices and then as we get into the professional development, these are things that we really need to be able to present to people, but to support the entire institution from the faculty and students through many different kinds of offices to understand what this all means. The next chapter is Chapter 6, and that one focuses in on professional development. I will be going over professional development a little bit more in the slides, but in this chapter there's sort of an overview about professional development. There is a description of each of the constituents that are involved in prior learning assessment and the kind of role that they have. Instead of putting this elsewhere, I put it in the professional development because it starts to address these kind of skills and knowledge that different people need in order to have a successful program. When we were in Atlantic City in October, each of the institutions had representatives that worked with me in 2 different sessions that were extended work sessions, and out of that we really discussed different types of professional development and strategies. As part of the activity, people brainstormed and really worked through things that would also work in their own college environment. So the rest of the chapter talks about the different types of professional development, the strategies that can be used, and then does have kind of it's a combining piece because it wasn't done by institutions, but as we kind of did as group work, but different approaches that the colleges identified that they thought would be effective in their institution. So that gives you a sense of some different ways of looking at professional development other than just a workshop. The last chapter in the book is on PLA program evaluation. There is very little that is done in programs that I have looked at across the United States in program evaluation. One institution that we studied had a very extensive program evaluation because they decided to treat the PLA program in the same way as any other academic program. And that makes a lot of sense. It is an academic process. It is talking about academic programming and credits, and so it has to have the same integrity as any academic department. And in that institution, they use the exact same evaluation format. But basically, we need to start to see that these programs are evaluated, and you know, really the target audience, they're the students, the faculty, the evaluators. There are other constituents within the institution that you might want to gather from, but this is a minimum. There are surveys, interviews, focus groups, outside evaluations. There really are also different kinds of data in terms of student persistence that can be collected, looking at who the students are, how successful they are, and looking really at that whole persistence and graduation piece. So there's long-term data that could be collected as well. In some of the research that's been done, the CALE study that they put out in the 2010, Fueling the Race, it's on their website under the year 2010. They've done extensive work in looking at the persistence and completion rates of students who participate in PLA programs. And at the associate's degree, I think it's a little bit more than 2 times the rate for completion when students, at an associate's degree, when students participate in some type of PLA program. So that data is out there, and what's important is also for institutions to be able to collect similar data and see how they are doing across this national data. There were 48 institutions in that data set, over 65,000 students. So it's a fairly extensive data set. So there's that kind of way that institutions could also start to look at some of the other research that's out there. The handbook addresses the research, and there is a reference to a chapter in a book that I did that is a review of all the research up through 2010, or maybe it's 11, excuse me, 2011. But what is good in there is it gives institutions, there's a table that lists all the different kinds of research that's out there, so you can start to see some of the trends of what's happening. So next we're going to go into talking about the 5 critical factors inventory. And if you could go to the next slide. Again, here's the 5 critical factors from the work that we've been doing. And so we start to talk about having another layer of questions that go with this: who, what, where, when, how, and what are the resources. So in parallel to this, we've created an inventory that really is in extensive detail about how each of these 5 critical factors are addressed within your PLA program. The next slide has a sample of one of the sets of questions. This is under the philosophy, mission, policy. And you can sort of see that the questions that are being asked are really in a kind of an in-depth piece. In the handbook is the full inventory. And in that inventory, we have given that out to each of the institutions. In the next slide, we provided it to the college representatives at the October meeting in Atlantic City, and we had a due date in December. At this point, we have 3 of the institutions, and we're missing the remaining 4. What somebody from Achieving the Dream will be in touch with the ones that are outstanding, and I really need those back no later than February 1st, because I will be doing a compiling of what all of that looks like, and so I would only have a 2-week turnaround to get basically an analysis across all 7 institutions on that entire inventory. We will be using that for the next step in terms of developing common standards, which is part of what the grant is requiring. So this is a pitch. If some of you may not be aware of this and may not be responsible for it, but to encourage folks within your campuses when you're notified to, or if you know that you still have it, to get in, that we really do need to get that in. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit here to professional development. And you know, there are some topics that everybody needs to know. There are topics for that really look at those philosophical backgrounds. When you have people who are resistant, what's important is to understand what it is that they're really resistant about. And in fact, you can't complain about something if you don't care about it. And so if somebody's complaining, it's important to get behind the scenes and get a better understanding of what the issues are. And being able to understand it from a philosophical point of view takes it away from the personal, but rather helps to start to place it within a mapping. So this is an area that is a really good discussion area for the institution. Really looking at policies and procedures. Again, it doesn't matter who you are in the institution, you should know those things. Understanding the different kinds of PLA, the opportunities that are offered, and the ways in which the learning is acquired is important, and understanding how the PLA is meeting learning outcomes and can be applied to different degrees, certificates, different credentials. So those are sort of the overall topics that everybody should know about. Then as we start to look at the next slide, talks about the constituents who are involved. And there's actually a few slides on this, but I need to kind of point out a few things. Each of these groups have their own needs in terms of their professional development. Administration is interested in the business model. They also are interested in looking at overall institutional outcomes, things like student persistence, completion rates. They would need to know that this is successful and doing the kinds of things that they need it to do. And so their focus is really going to be on things like the business model, the background research, and looking at the evaluation of the programs. You also have a program oversight. Usually a lot of institutions have program directors. They may have an office that completely focuses in on it, or it may be integrated, but there's still usually somebody who is looking at that. That person really needs to know everything about it, and also is responsible in many ways for the whole institution's professional development. So that becomes the expert person who can really advocate for all layers of the prior learning assessment. In our institution, I have the overall role of that, sitting under our provost, because I'm also at SUNY Empire State College. But within we have 9 undergraduate centers across the state of New York, and within each center we also have program directors and staffing because it's an extensive program here. So different schools will have different kinds of structures, but you do need somebody who can really be the advocate and understand all the ins and outs of that. There's also the academic integrity piece. Some schools will allow the program director to be the last say in terms of accepting the credits. but many schools use department chairs. There needs to be faculty oversight, and so one has to really think about that academic integrity piece in terms of who's responsible and the types of professional development that they need to have to understand the ways in which to interpret the credits and to accept them into the student's degree. If you're using evaluators, the different types of PLA, some of them will be evaluated outside of the institution, such as like a CLEP exam, military credit, and different kinds of corporate training that either American Council on Education or the National College Credit Recommendation Service have done. And in those cases, sometimes the faculty want to be able to look at those results, but they're not actually doing the assessment. When you're doing challenge exams, an internal challenge exam, or the individual portfolio assessment, then you are going to need an evaluator. Internal evaluators are usually your own faculty or a professional staff with the right credentialing that would be equivalent to what you would hire at least for an adjunct faculty member. And you also have external evaluators. Our institution, to give you a sense of the volume that we do, is that we have between 4,000 and 5,000 students working on portfolio assessments at any given time. We have over 1,000 evaluators, and probably 75% of them are external, in part because we just don't have enough faculty to go and focus on this when they've got other teaching load and advising load. But also, many of our students have knowledge in areas that where faculty don't have the expertise. So the external faculty often are content experts from the field, and also will need more information about prior learning assessment because they may not have been exposed to it at all, while the internal faculty, hopefully, with ongoing discussions within the institution, have a better sense of what's going on. So sometimes the external faculty need much more prior learning assessment. Another form of prior learning assessment that I didn't go through the different types because I talked about this in October and I will again in February, is something that we call professional learning evaluations. We work with a lot of our partners and evaluate the training that they may do in industry or a lot of our agencies, state agencies, et cetera. And so we do a combination of internal and external evaluators for that particular kind of assessment, which is slightly, it has its own uniqueness about it. So we do additional training for those evaluators, even if they've been evaluating portfolio assessments before, because this is a little different. The next slide talks about the student advisors, and really when we think about advising, it starts with recruiters, it happens in admissions, and it happens with the academic advisors. All levels need to understand PLA because in many cases, and in our institution, we find that the recruiters become that first word with students when they learn that your institution will look at their prior learning and that there's a chance that they might get some academic credits for it. That recruiter needs to have a good handle on what they're saying in order to make sure that the students have the accurate information before they attend. And so that becomes very important during the admissions process. Admissions also are the ones that usually get the transcripts when they're sent in, and there needs to be a real understanding of the different kinds of academic documentation that is official that needs to be sent in, and that admissions handles it. So there is an additional piece for admissions that a lot of people don't think about. Academic advisors, again, that's going to be a critical piece. In many institutions, the academic advisor also helps the students develop their PLA requests. That may happen within a center or a learning center, but in any case, the role of doing the advisement is an important piece. The next slide really talks about the different student service areas that, and I didn't put admissions here because I've thought of them more in terms of advising, but Each of these offices, the registrar's office, is going to really need to be thinking in terms of applying them to the degrees and keeping record of this. There are lots of, depending on your student information system, there may be some special work that has to be done. We've got to do an extensive amount in our institution, so it's important to get them involved in the conversation. Financial aid is important because there are lots of features here that need to be thought through. For example, if the prior learning assessment is considered advanced standing, does it get used towards the student's level, which can make a difference on how much financial aid they get? At this time, federal financial aid will not cover financial aid fees, but that may be changing. They've just announced the experimental sites for looking at prior learning assessment as being accepted within financial aid. Empire State College just learned last week that we are one of the experimental sites, so there'll be more coming out about that. There are ways of looking at prior learning assessment if it's a requirement of the program where every single student is doing it. That can be written as a program cost. So there's some very interesting things that the financial aid has to get around their head. The business or bursar's office, depending on your structure with your institution, needs to be thinking about a lot of times portfolio assessment is paid by employers. So there's third-party payments on these. If there are fees that are going to be charged, how to log them onto the student record, things like that. You have the Learning Center. As I mentioned before, some learning centers are where students get the support, especially if they're doing portfolio assessment, on how to put the materials together. But also a lot of learning centers have taken on the role of being an exam center for standardized exams and also to study for those exams. So there may be some added features that the Learning Center would be addressing. In the next slide, we talk about the institutional support rather than student support. The marketing, just like the recruiters, marketing here is very important, and to have the website to be very accurate and that it's easy to find. I've done a little bit of research where I've looked at different websites, and some schools' prior learning assessment is super easy to find, and some of them is so buried that it's impossible for students to learn about it, and that message tells students it doesn't exist, even though it might. The technology, as I've already mentioned under the support section, it's a very important piece to have the technology folks right on board, working with the student information systems and also looking at any kind of management software and looking at the possibility of either e-portfolios or another kind of way that students can be logging all of these pieces. If your institution is already playing with e-portfolios, there's a lot that you can do with e-portfolios. We have a couple grants that we've been working on really extending the use of e-portfolios for prior learning assessment. I think it's a really positive upcoming area. Institutional research and outcomes assessment sometimes are the same office and sometimes they are separated, but there will be a lot of data that needs to be addressed that the IR department can be working on, but looking at outcomes assessment and the ways in which different programs are meeting those might have a completely different role when we start to look at the outcomes, the competencies from the prior learning and how that starts to be addressed for looking at the students meeting program outcomes as well as institutional outcomes. The last group is the students and partners. Well, you don't usually think about students getting professional development. We kind of think about, well, we have to tell them what to do. But one of the best recruiters are the students, and so the more they understand about PLA, the more they will be sharing it. So if it is something you really want to be doing, the more you can inform your students is really good. Also, a lot of the students are in the workplace, and they help make connections with partnerships and encouraging that environment. We have been really the last few years doing a lot around partnerships, and also when I talked about the professional learning evaluations where we go in and evaluate the training. At this point, it's probably our largest growing area in PLA, and we get a fair number of students from that. What happens is in that partnership, you also do a lot of recruitment, and so I'll give you an example. We just completed an assessment of the radiological technologists coming out of the hospital-based programs across the state, and students now going for an associate's degree are able to bring in 40 credits towards their associate's degree in radiological technologies. We're now working with all those hospitals to recruit their students into our associate's degree program. And because we're an associate's degree and bachelor's and master's, we're then able to give those students a pathway all the way up based on that. So, you know, we may not have reached that many people before, but by developing a clear partnership with all the hospital-based programs and by providing a way for credits to come over, we now have access to I think there's 42 hospital programs across the state. So it really is an incredible way to build your partnerships and to support students in the process. Okay, going on, types of professional development. There are formal and informal ones that I have listed here. It goes into, in the manual, there's a lot more that are listed. I'm going to go right on to strategies on the next slide. And part of it is that I feel that the best way to really help bring people along is to directly address fears and concerns. So there is a section in the manual to really talk about addressing the fears and the concerns and ways of helping folks really focus in on those pieces, but to get more of the reality and the facts about it and not build on assumptions. So one of the things that happens a lot is a fear of workload, to really look at that. There's a fear of the integrity. Well, let's look at that. And let's just build a general understanding and trust. And so there's a fair amount in the manual that talks about some strategies around that. Defining college-level learning, as I said, there is no real definition out there. Occasionally I come across a school that has taken the time to define it, but for the most part it does not exist. And so looking at existing frameworks such as our GLQF and developing your own operational definition so that the faculty are really comfortable. It also is a way to really improve one's own curriculum because, as I said before, you can't start talking about assessment without looking at it across the board. The last slide talks about some of the strategies that were developed from the workshop, and these are just some of the themes that came out of it. But really looking at a communication plan around PLA, and there are lots of little suggestions in the manual about what could be in that and the ways of doing it. Using active research, you know, again, the whole strategy of addressing concerns really is let's develop some research studies and really look at these and you know, see what's the pattern within our own institution so that we can get a sense of it. That really brings people along very well. Really looking at the support that each constituent needs and making sure that institutional support is in place. But by identifying the support, it's also a form of professional development, because when people have to stop and reflect upon their own needs, it's a way of being able to understand what they can do and what they need support around. So it's a good technique. Getting involved in the technology structures, there is a form in itself of a professional development because, again, as you're trying to solve how technology is going to support the process, people get to know the technologies better, but they also start to get to know PLA better. And then really working with partnerships. Looking at, in this case, you have a consortium of 7 institutions, being able to continue the dialogue across those, looking at other institutions that have PLA, getting faculty to talk to faculty, those are important, and then partnerships with industry as well. So I've been talking actually for 45 minutes. I just realized the time, and Meredith has been collecting any of the questions, so I think I will turn it to her and then see if there are any additional questions that we would like to address.
Great, thank you, Nan. And so at this point, I would like to invite people to type questions into the questions pane. We'd love to hear some of your questions. There has been a lot of great content that we've talked about in the handbook, and also specifically around professional development and the constituents who might benefit from this professional development. So I want to give folks a chance to be able to to be able to type in any questions. So any questions at this time? I did actually, kind of to kick off the questions. Nan, I had a question particularly about when involving external faculty. And so in some cases, how do you consider onboarding external faculty for the PLA process?
Okay.
And how familiar do they need to be with institutional norms and things like that?
So there are a couple of things that we've done at Empire State College. And again, remember, we're talking about a very large number, so we had to look at lots of different strategies. So usually we're looking for people, the referrals to get people can be anything from, you bump into somebody and somehow something comes out and you realize that person is an expert in a field and you just happen to have somebody who is trying to get credit in that, all the way to actually recruiting through some of our centers have had to do ads for particular ones. We often look to other institutions, so we'll turn to faculty in one of the other SUNY institutions or the CUNY institutions. Those are kind of one of our first layers. We look at industries in the environment to see if they have anyone. Once we have somebody, usually, as I said before, they don't really have a background in PLA, and so often there's a phone call with that person and a discussion about PLA. We also, when we're doing the portfolio assessment, where we give the evaluator an opportunity to look at the materials that the student has provided before they actually accept the assignment. And we've built our own technology. That's a homegrown system that we can do all of this electronically. So they go in and they are able to read it and then accept it or not. We found that this was uneven. That had been our practice for a long time, but some people, depending on who they were talking with, et cetera, they just either had more or less professional development. So then we started doing workshops, and with our workshops, the most successful model was to take internal faculty, external folks, people who've been seasoned with us, people who are new to it, and bring them all together and do case studies. So that worked really well when we teamed up people, because somebody who's been doing it for a while in some ways had a better way of relating to somebody just starting. Again, those workshops weren't always attended and weren't always successful. So we felt that as an institution we needed to have some standard material that could be pulled upon, and we have just completed a website for all of our evaluators that's open. What I will do, Meredith, is I will send you a link and you can send it out to folks and they can go to it. It's just been released, I mean, literally. We're already wanting to revise it, but it gives us a baseline of the knowledge that we think everybody should have. And now what the centers are doing is they're using that website to build their workshops so that there's more material, becomes a resource for them as well as a place to send evaluators.
Great, thank you, Nan. And a quick reminder that Achieving the Dream will be sending out the PowerPoint, a link to the recording, as well as any materials, Nan, that you referenced on today's webinar. We do have a question from Atlantic Cape Community College. And Nan, this is specifically about technology to support PLA. Are there off-the-shelf programs, or are most colleges using homegrown technology?
So I wish there was off-the-shelf programs. I think in another 5 years we'll see at least modules being added in, but for the most part it's been homegrown. That said, we're trying to get ourselves off of homegrown because it's very time-consuming to keep that going and upgraded. And currently, our own systems are built on a platform that doesn't even exist out there anymore. So, we're really stuck if we don't do something different. So, one of the projects that we've been working on is to revamp the way that we're using our student information system. We are on DataTel's colleague, and what we're doing, there's a parallel over to many of the other student information systems. And SUNY created an initiative to get all of the SUNY institutions on DegreeWorks, and the other part for us is that our students design their curriculum around competency-based statements. So our curriculum is a little different. And so we were able to work with DegreeWorks and had one of their programmers help us figure out how to program in competencies. As a result, I think we have a model that could be used for other people. We're almost to the point where we can be very functional and bring in all types of prior learning assessment, store everything into our student information system, and have it move over into DegreeWorks. I'm hoping by September that will be a completely standard for all students. And then we also have been working in e-portfolios, and so we have a couple grants that we've been working on for designing e-portfolios. We've actually worked on 3 different e-portfolio systems, and I've got sub-projects working in actually all 3 of them, because what we're finding is that everyone has good things, and then there's some things that have some shortcomings. But what we're trying to develop is an e-portfolio thinking around prior learning assessment. And the goal is that if the students had an e-portfolio where they collected all of their knowledge and started developing ways of demonstrating it, so even if they have a CLEP or a more standardized assessment, that would also be in the portfolio as well as the individual portfolios. So a lot of that work will start to come out. We're looking at some other funding to kind of polish it up, but the idea that we're trying to do is to say, how can people retrofit what they've already got and not have to invest in whole new systems?
Great. Thank you. So at this point, I do not see any other audience questions, but I know that this webinar has probably started some excellent college discussions. I know many of you have teams with you who are participating in today's webinar, and we really appreciate your participation. In terms of next steps, I want to reiterate that Achieving the Dream will be sending out specifically to webinar attendees and project directors a recording of today's webinar, the PowerPoint from today's webinar, and the handbook and any other references or resources that were referenced on today's webinar. What we'll do, first I will thank all of you for participating in today's webinar and would like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Nan Travers for her excellent presentation. I'm going to launch a poll to evaluate today's webinar, and so you'll be able to respond to that poll. Yes, Pam?
I just wanted to also say that I know that this was a lot of materials kind of really squished in. So, you know, if people could take the next few weeks to really look at the manual, one of the things that we are going to ask in the February is for input. And if you have input any sooner than that, we would really appreciate it. So if there are suggestions you have, areas that you want more information, clarity around things that you think was stressed too much, that kind of thing, any of that input would be really good ahead of time because we are going to do some revision before the February one and would love to have that ahead of time. But I always think of these as living documents, so the more you can give us feedback on this and really address what's needed. In addition, we'll be going into more detail in certain areas, so if there are certain questions that you really start to pop up for you and you really would hope that I would address in February, if you could send them along also, because I can adjust plans based on your needs.
Great. Thank you, Nan. I appreciate those comments, and also, again, reiterate that we do welcome specific comments after you review the handbook with your college team so that we can make any adjustments or improvements to the handbook. So at this time, we will launch a poll that we ask for you all to respond to. So you should be seeing that, and you and your teams can respond to any of those that you agree with. So right now I'm seeing that 0% have voted, but I know that the number is going to go up. Oh, we're up to 20%, 30%, 50% have voted at this point. 70. We're getting closer. We're up at 80%. Perhaps another response or two. Okay, last call. We're going to close the poll. Excellent. So now we're sharing the results of the poll. So we're seeing that for many of you, this webinar answered your questions. Many of you found this webinar to be engaging and informative. Many of you found this webinar to be relevant to your role. And many of you also indicated that this webinar gave you tips that you can use in your job. For those who did not find this webinar as useful, we do want to make sure to give you the information that you need. So we certainly welcome any feedback after the webinar, and you can email me, Meredith Hatch, mhatch@achievingthedream.org. So again, I thank you all for participating in today's webinar, and do please be on the lookout for an email with different resources in it from today's webinar. Thank you, and have a great rest of the week.